What really interests me, actually, is that was your father doing a very different kind of job in architecture to the one that you have done.
Yes.
And I'm curious about how one might have led to the other.
Right, well, the interesting thing, which I sort of discovered a bit about these things, I was sort of thinking about this today, and my dad, as you'll hear from my talk, didn't get on with his father. Actually, my grandfather, who was an architect, said that university was a complete waste of time and he should come into his practice and work up from the bottom, sort of like an apprentice. And I don't know whether that's the reason, but my dad was, I mean, of course I had the possibility, I suppose, of going into my father's practice, but I started, immediately, while I was still at university, fiddling around with old buildings, and started with sort of watermills, because nobody wanted to convert watermills or use watermills. Country houses came later. And my dad was sort of, and my mum as well, they were hugely supportive. They were really excited that, and actually it was that period in my dad's career where, buildings were getting, it was sort of, I don't know, the schemes were getting more and more complicated, the sort of government centre in Taif and that kind of thing, incredibly complicated and probably pretty stressful for my dad, although he kept going till he was sort of, in his mid-80s. And so I think he was hugely supported that I had found a sort of niche which I found interesting, which was in the same world as his own. And of course he was always hugely interested in historic buildings and the history of architecture, hugely interested. So anyway, sorry, I've gone on too long.
Well, no, but it just struck me that they lived in a converted watermill.
Exactly. Well, they lived in lots of converted houses. I mean, I was born in Vault House with Mill Hill in Hampstead. And then they had a barn conversion next door to Llewellyn Davis in Hertfordshire. And then they lived, you'll see some of this on the thing. In fact, actually, when I think about it, they've almost entirely lived in, there was a little house in Portugal, you'll see, which is new. But most of them were converted buildings.
Which often happens with architects.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, they're in nice places, and they're interesting buildings.
And how conscious were you of the people in the circle, as it were, circle in both senses?
Well, I mean, in terms of people like Ben Nicholson, you
yes.
mean? Oh, well, hugely conscious, of course. I mean, I wasn't, obviously, I hadn't, Circle was 1937, but Ben Nicholson particularly was a sort of big part of our lives. I mean, when he came back from Switzerland to live in England, as he got older, he came to live in my dad's watermill. So, I mean, we knew him extremely well. And in fact, as you'll hear from my talk, the correspondence between them is in the Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh, and it's just wonderful, some of the correspondence, because Ben was a chap with a huge sense of humour. And so, and of course, Miriam's dad, Gabbo, of course, I knew quite well too. Yes. So those were the two particular ones, I suppose, that I Ben very well indeed.
Yes, yes. Actually, I was in Tate St Ives a couple of weeks ago, asking for the catalogue of the current exhibition, and they showed me this rather flimsy sort of pamphlet, and I said, well, that's probably what Ben Nicholson would have called a dogalogue.
Exactly, yeah. And of course, Barbara Hepworth, obviously, was extremely close with Mum and Dad. Yeah.
Yes, and all those lovely pictures that hung around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is that your taste in art?
Well, I suppose it is. I mean, I've still got, some lovely small pictures of Ben at home, but also quite a mix of stuff, I suppose, around my house, which is fun, and there's a reason for all of them.
Yes.
They're either some 18th century bloke who's built the house that I've been restoring, or they're perhaps a little Ben Nicholson drawing. So it's rather fun having them all muddled up together.
Yes, I mean, I was privileged to take two groups when I was a Cambridge student out to the mill and had the tour, and it sort of felt quite educational, as though everything was there to point to lessons.
Well, but you see, Dad had a huge mix, didn't he? I mean, there were the Peruvian pots. There were all sorts of different parts of life.
Yes, it was a modern movement interior.
It was a completely modern movement, but he loved Elizabethan portraits. I don't know if you remember, there were a number of really good Elizabethan portraits.
Yes.
There's very kind of, and of course he loved, the sort of naive paintings and so on. Yeah, and so there was quite a sort of mix of art that I grew up with at home.
And he was a rather snappy dresser as well, wasn't he?
Well, I don't know. I mean, he was original dresser. He was original dresser. Yeah. And
I remember a dark shirt with a white.
That's always a white tie. Yeah.
Yes.
And always white socks, which worry people nowadays.
Yes.
You know.